Okay, so thanks everyone for coming. My name is Vera. Myself and Vern head up talks at Google for the Toronto office. This is our second installment. We're sticking on this charity train. I love it very much. So we have Dr. Samantha Nutt from War Child here with us today. Adam Green, as you all know, who's from the agency team, who's the creative lead. He will be hosting, and welcome. Thank you for coming. If you do have any questions, please walk up to the mics as there are people on the live stream, and we are recording this. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks, Vera. And welcome, Samantha.
Thank you.
Excellent. Thanks for coming into Google. So for those who aren't familiar with your work, if you could tell us a little bit about what is War Child and the work that you guys do around the world.
So War Child is an international non-governmental organization and charity, and we work with children and their families on the front lines of most of the world's most significant and intense conflicts. So essentially what we are is we're a protection agency. So we go into environments to work with those kids and their families to make sure that they are safe, that their needs are being met, and that they have opportunities to rebuild their lives and rebuild their communities over the long term. The ways in which we do that, what we focus on, we have three pillars. So one is education, making sure that kids in war are allowed to maintain their education, catch up on their education, and grow to be thriving members of their community. The second part of what we do, it sounds a little bit technical, but it's justice work. And so we make sure that, especially in environments where girls and young boys can be sexually assaulted, where their rights are routinely being violated, we work to actually promote and uphold the rule of law by training lawyers and paralegals, defending the rights of those children actively within those communities, but also through the legal infrastructure if one exists. And then the third part of what we do, we call opportunity, which is really about making sure that families are economically self-reliant and have the opportunity to provide for themselves, to try to break that cycle of aid dependency that plagues so many humanitarian catastrophes around the world, but just making sure that those families have resources at their own disposal to be able to make the right kinds of decisions that will be suitable for them and for their children.
It's fantastic work.
Thank you.
So you work in some of the most miserable and dangerous places in the world, places where there is effectively active war going on, and most of what we hear is how do they get emergency aid, enough sutures, enough water, enough plasma in there. How do you guys get in books and lawyers and actually work with people on building longer, better lives?
Well, I think, Adam, you've hit on a really good point, which is that when we think about crises in other parts of the world, and especially war, unfortunately our memories are pretty short, right? And so we think about the emergency phase, so food, water, shelter, blankets, vaccination programs, the things that you need to give to keep people alive. But people also need reasons to live. And when wars drag on, as they so frequently do, if you look at the war in Syria now, it's in its 6th year. The war in Sudan has been, apart from a few moments where it hasn't been as intense, it's been going on for many decades now. Other parts of the Middle East, if you look at Eastern Congo, where it's nearly 20 years, Somalia, where it's multiple decades, as those wars drag on, those gaps and those needs become that much more enormous. And unfortunately, our capacity to remain involved and demonstrate compassion tends to dwindle as those conflicts drag on. And unfortunately, that's when the needs become even greater, because you've got kids that have been out of school for 5, 6, 10 years. You've got families that have completely drained all of their financial resources, that have lost their land, lost their livelihoods. You have a legal infrastructure, a protective environment that has essentially been destroyed, where there may not be any police, there may not be a functioning judicial infrastructure. So if your rights are being violated, if you're being raped and abused, you have no recourse. And so that's what War Child focuses on. And in order to do that, you have to mobilize those local communities. You have to make sure that they have the skills and the capacity to be able to do the work, that they have the resources, and fundamentally, you have to make sure that you have a long-term vision. War is a long-term problem, and by continuing to only plug those gaps, we aren't, I think, fundamentally addressing the reasons why some of these communities tend to be locked in that cycle of violence and poverty and, frankly, despair in the first place.
So you mentioned the war in the Congo. We had the good fortune of having Malala Yousafzai's parents here the other week, and he mentioned that the children that are sitting in camps today getting no education. They are the ISIS of tomorrow. They are the wars of tomorrow. They are the terrorists of tomorrow. The DRC came through one of the worst wars in modern history. There are an estimated 7.5 million kids there who are getting no education. Is that really the demographic time bomb that the Malala's dad was fearing?
Certainly, it is true that kids who have almost nothing in environments where there is a tremendous amount of violence, where there's recruitment that's going on by various armed groups, militia groups. In the case of the Congo, it's an inordinate number of people that are recruiting and abducting young people to fight in that conflict in a climate of absolute impunity. So certainly young people who are unemployed, who are not in school, who have witnessed horrific abuses, who have been the victims of horrific abuses themselves, they are certainly more vulnerable to that level of recruitment, to that kind of ideological pull that many of those armed groups will offer them. I mean, we know, War Child knows, even from the work that we've done all around the world, that when we have done skills training with young people, when we have worked with teachers and other educators to make sure that they had access to education, could go back to school at an appropriate grade level, because if you're 17 and you've been fighting with a militia group in Eastern Congo and you're functionally illiterate, you don't want to go back to being in grade 1 with a bunch of 6-year-olds. I mean, that's humiliating for you. So that becomes a huge barrier. So yes, education is critically important. It's not the only thing, though. Economic development becomes critically important, making sure that their psychological needs are being addressed, and that overarching framework of a lack of accountability is one of the biggest challenges, too.
Yeah, you make in your book a pretty strong case that on the Venn diagram of humanity, where cheap small arms and idle young men intersect, is a recipe for war. So bringing education in hopefully pulls the idle young men out of that equation. But how far can you get when AK-47s cost $10 in a lot of these places? Education is a huge part. What about arms control?
Arms control is absolutely critical, and I think that there is, it's especially important right now that we talk about this issue. You know, when you look at the rise of ISIS in the Middle East, if you look at even the devastating attacks that have taken place in the United States, even in Orlando, Florida, the easy availability of automatic and semi-automatic weapons, small arms more generally, creates both opportunity and means for those who seek to destroy and harm to be able to do so. And the proliferation of small arms, especially in unstable environments, is, I think, one of the single greatest threats to public health and global peace and security in existence in the world today. We have seen a dramatic increase in the sale of those arms and the manufacturing of those weapons since September 11th over the past now more than 15 years. And so if you have a lawless environment where there is very little employment, where you've got half the population roughly that is under the age of 30, and in some cases under the age of 18, you are going to have a situation where people will take up arms to resolve grievances, to earn an income, and to express their will and their particular ideology. So the arms in and of themselves, I mean, it's that adding that into the equation is one of the hardest issues to address in a war zone. You have to, disarmament is absolutely critical to peace and prosperity.
And a lot of the talk about armament revolves around the locations where the arms are, but most of those guns are not coming from sub-Saharan Africa or the Middle East. They're manufactured within a couple hundred kilometers of where we're sitting right now. The United States is the largest arms exporter in the world, and very recently with the LAV deal in Saudi Arabia, Canada had the dubious distinction of being declared the number 2 arms dealer in the Middle East. We just jumped
to number 2, yeah.
So does that talk need to happen here? Usually when we talk about arms control and proliferation, it's on the nuclear scale. Like our militaries tend to be obsessed with state versus state conflict. We're spending $1 trillion on the next fighter jet program, the F-35. That's the entire aid budget of the world, roughly, the NGO budget. At what point does arms control need to start talking about, like, 20 caliber things that sit in someone's purse in Texas, but then can be used to end dozens of lives in somewhere like Sierra Leone?
Well, I think you've asked, there's sort of multiple pieces to that question, which is, I think, a very, very important one. On the issue of small arms being available and accessible, the problem with small arms, many of them, look at the Kalashnikov rifle, they are virtually indestructible. They are the preferred weapon.
Yeah, it's made to be buried in sand and still keep working.
And so if you make it here, or you make it in the United States, or it's made in Russia or in China or wherever else, once it gets into an international market, that is rarely its last stop. And some of the ones that I have seen, and frankly some of the ones that have been pointed at me over the years by young men, have been weapons that were made even in the 50s and 60s. They are very easy for kids to load and reload and to be trained to use. So any weapon like that enters the marketplace, it is a permanent problem. It is not a temporary problem. So that's one piece of it. In terms of who contributes to that, if you look at all weapons sales, so that includes everything, roughly 80% of all weapons that are sold in the world are manufactured by the United States is roughly half, but then usually it's England, Germany, France, Russia, China. So roughly 80% of them come from none other than the 5 permanent members of the United Nations Security Council, plus Germany. Unfortunately, now Canada is inching into that equation. And I think it's something that we have to consider very, very, very carefully, because it does, I think, undermine our international reputation. And we as Canadians can sometimes, we think that we're the world's peacekeepers, and that we have this reputation around the world of,
we're like number 58
human rights,
on the list.
And we're not that anymore. If we want to have that kind of prominence on the world stage and that credibility and that reputation, then I personally think that we have to really question whether or not our arms exports are consistent with that value of promoting, or those values of promoting peace and security and human rights. Because you can go to any war zone around the world and know that that is not the case.
So until we can do that, do you feel like you guys at War Child are kind of bailing the Titanic with a bucket as you try to educate people out of this, but almost unlimited free weapons are coming in the other side?
I think I would look at that metaphor slightly differently. I feel like sometimes you're on the deck of the Titanic and you can see the iceberg. You see kids and Syrian refugees living in camps who are becoming increasingly despondent because they don't have opportunity. You see Southern Sudanese families who are selling their children to arms groups because they've run out of resources and because they're increasingly desperate. So you feel like you're on the deck of the Titanic. You can see the iceberg, and you're going, "Hey, everybody, see the iceberg? See the iceberg?" Right? And yet it's not enough to change course. And that's the part that's incredibly frustrating for me. And I think for us as an organization, because you can feel it on the ground when it's happening. You can feel that shift, that moment when people transition from being hopeful to that sense of hopelessness, that sense that the world has forgotten them, that nobody cares about what's happening to them, that when that anger and that resentment begin to build, when they feel increasingly desperate. And it's no surprise then that almost a year within that moment, you start to see people putting their toddlers into rubber dinghies and trying to make it across the Mediterranean Sea to get them to safety.
When that's the best option for your family, things are unspeakably horrible.
That's right. That's the problem.
So your book is full of unbelievably harrowing stories, things that you've gone through. One of the things that struck me was the number of whip-smart, incredibly brave, educated women from around the world that you have worked with who have met with horrible, untimely ends. You make a really good case for the education of women and girls around the world. As a father of 2 little girls, I don't even think it's up for debate. But how risky is it as we educate them? Are we sending more people to the slaughter if we're not educating people on the other side, educating the angry young men with the $10 automatic rifles as to what society could and should look like if everyone was equal?
You have to do both. You don't have to do one at the exclusion of others. So educating girls doesn't mean that that comes at the expense of educating boys. And we've found that, Wartel's found that with our work all around the world. If you're not investing in what we call community-based sensitization, going into those communities, talking about the value of girls' education, demonstrating the importance of women's economic empowerment, proving that to those communities by having those women return, and they do become very productive members, and slowly you see people's minds and attitudes change. And you can't go in there with this giant sort of imperialistic agenda and your finger wagging and saying it's got to be this way and that's wrong, because if you do that, you're going to be shut out and shut down, and you may in fact put many of those young girls and women that you want to be helping at risk by virtue of behaving in that fashion.
And there's been some of that. Madonna had
there has been
education effort
yeah.
that ended in flames, and Oprah and a few others. You offer some pretty withering criticism in your book of people who just come in with an outside agenda into a local area and say, like, this is how it should be. How do you guys operate differently at War Child? How do you make sure you're not doing that?
Well, for us, our 98% of our staff are local. And we have several hundred staff around the world. So these are folks who come from war zones, who are working for us within those countries to build our programs, to identify the needs, to evaluate them, to make sure that we're asking the right questions and that we have that level of community legitimacy and acceptance before we even start. As I said, we're not an emergency organization. So we don't go in there and say, well, we're in the business of blankets, so here's your blanket. That's not what we do. We go in, we will have a 1-2 year process of information gathering, of collaboration, of conversation with local community groups, grassroots civil society organizations, UN agencies, other organizations on the ground to say, okay, what contribution can we make here? What are the needs? What needs are not being met? What is the overall risk to children in that community by not meeting those needs? And how can we help you? And I think that fundamentally is the question. If you go in and say, this is how we're going to help you, that's how aid goes wrong. If you go in and say, tell me about what's going on here, how can we help you? And you build it, and you're critical in that process and ask yourself the hard questions. It doesn't mean you'll always get it right, but it means you're more likely to get it right.
So come with more question marks, less exclamation points.
Absolutely. And you see that in a lot of crises. You see a lot of grandstanding. And for me, over the years, I've been doing this work for 20 years. It's kind of been the bane of my existence. People who have no experience in Iraq, and then they've been there for 2 days, and they stand up and they say, children are starving here. And you look at them and you go, where the hell have you been? Yes, they have been starving here for the last 10 years, actually, thanks to the sanctions. But
welcome to the ninth inning.
Yeah, welcome.
We've been playing this baseball game for a while.
That's right.
You also offer some pretty heady criticism of well-meaning do-gooders. How can we in the privileged West help folks that actually is productive? You're pretty critical of things like voluntourism, of ping pong ball funding, where you fund a government that funds the UN, that then funds their local region, that then funds an NGO, and by the time someone in need actually gets the money, it's like small pennies on the dollar. What can we do that's actually effective from this end?
Well, there are a number of things. I mean, the more directly you can contribute to an organization that is working on the ground with those grassroots partners, that means that your money is going to go much further. So every time, if you're committing to an organization that then has an international arm, and then it gets kind of divided, and then it will end up at the field level, the impact of your dollar is diluted. So that's something to be very mindful of, is to always make sure, ask organizations, what is their programming model? Are they a directly implementing agency? Because that's very, very, very critical. The second piece of it is, so much of our aid money is wasted because of one thing. And that one thing is inconsistency. Because we see a crisis in the news, we might write a check once or go online and donate, and then here we are 5, 6, 7 years later going, well, why don't things get any better in places like Haiti? I mean, these kinds of challenges, you're really talking about structural deficits. And like anything else, it takes time. And so we know here, if you're talking about education, it's not enough to send a kid to school for a week. or a month or even a year. It is a long-term investment. So you are far better off as a donor giving and this is always when my director of development has a heart attack, but he's going, don't say this, but you're far better off giving a smaller amount of money on a regular basis than you are writing a check once and then forgetting about it. It allows organizations to properly plan, to implement in areas that the world has often forgotten and has shown less interest in. It allows you to direct those resources to the highest need environments and not be so subjected to the whims and mercies of the media cycle, for example. So that's one way to do it. Don't give things like hard goods, clothes, and books and all that stuff. It won't get there in time to be useful. It's too expensive to ship and distribute.
Yeah, cash flies a lot cheaper than books.
Cash is a lot better. It's a much better way of doing it. And in fact, many organizations now are looking at cash vouchers for refugees because then they can make their own decisions around what their family needs. We have this very paternalistic approach. It's like, no, you're going to have 10 bags of rice and 6 blankets. And a lot of those refugee families are sitting there saying, actually, I don't eat rice and I got enough blankets, but that's kind of how we do it,
I don't
right?
need more blankets.
And so now we're changing that attitude and making it a little bit more, certainly more empowering, but also recognizing the value of cash contributions. And labor, gifts in kind like labor are extremely valuable, especially to organizations that might have headquarters locally. People have various skills that they could bring to our organization, but that volunteer work is most helpful to us here. Unless you are a seasoned expert who understands development, understands the context, understands the risks involved, frankly, when you're going overseas and doing this kind of work, you might be taking those opportunities away from local community groups, which is something to be mindful of. A lot of it is busy work philanthropy. Do you really need to go and repaint that classroom, or is there somebody else that, with the money you save on your ticket, could be hired
perhaps a local painter
to pay that to paint that classroom, right? And then the second piece of it is it's a huge security risk for most agencies. So sometimes the better way for you to contribute, in fact, every way, often the better way to contribute is to be a donor and to help here if you can.
Excellent. So I want to bring it back to Google for a second. We have this mantra, don't be evil. We all like to think of ourselves as really good people. But pretty much all of us have a tiny slice of unspeakable evil sitting in our pocket right now. The minerals that go into these, particularly coltan mined in the DRC, is an engine of human misery. Why do you think the industry collectively can't get on top of that? We did it with diamonds. Why not other minerals?
It's a lot more complicated than diamonds, and I'm not offering that up as an excuse, but more of an explanation. I mean, you can take a diamond and look at it under a microscope and know exactly where it came from, and so conflict tracing in that sort of environment became somewhat easier than with coltan. I mean, coltan, it's estimated that the Congo contains between 60 to 80% of the world's coltan deposits. It is readily smuggled across Congo's borders. It ends up in international markets. It generates hundreds of millions of dollars in revenues and often used towards arms sales for various Congolese-backed military groups and militia groups operating in that unstable part of the world. But by the time it gets to your cell phone, you have no idea whether it's Congolese coltan or any other kind of coltan. Chances are, just based on probability, it is Congolese coltan. I think, to be honest, this is an issue that the industry itself needs to actively get behind and start to look at what solutions are viable and make the most sense. A straight-out ban, unfortunately, it follows the law of unintended consequences. And under the Dodd-Frank legislation in the United States that required more accountability in companies not to use conflict minerals, what happened was a lot of American firms closed their mines. That put a lot of artisanal miners out of work. And what happens when you have no employment? You join a militia group because they are the only employer. So again, the laws of unintended consequences. What we really need is sectoral reform. We need to look at how you fix the climate of impunity at the same time. You have to come at it from a number of different perspectives. It can be done, but none of that will ever happen unless one other thing happens, and that's that the industry itself has to be prepared to confront this in an honest and transparent way.
The tech industry or the mining industry or
the
both?
entire industry, tech and mining, because the two really go hand in hand,
Yeah.
right?
We're
That's
sitting
where
in
you're
a really
getting your
unique
components
place. We're
from.
at a big tech company, and within 10-block radius of this office is the highest concentration of mining company headquarters in the world. So we might be in this office somewhat uniquely placed to tackle this issue.
You are uniquely placed to tackle this issue. And every time any effort has been brought about to introduce legislation around this that would force, frankly, mining companies to be more accountable and transparent, it's been met by very heavy lobbying, expensive lobbying on the part of those mining industries, and it has been shut down.
Yeah,
And
Bill C-300 got shut down. Very narrowly, though. It was only like 10 votes.
And then Paul Dewar was trying to introduce legislation as well, who was the NDP foreign affairs critic who lost his seat recently in the election. But he also had taken steps around this issue. And again, I don't want to, it's not, the answers are not simple. It does need a development approach. It needs a governance approach. It needs a diplomatic approach. But all of that can happen as long as there is acknowledgement from the industry and a willingness to lead change. And if we could even start there and begin to have those conversations.
Just recognize that we have a problem.
Recognize we have a problem. And that's exactly what happened with conflict diamonds. For a while, the industry was like, there isn't a problem, and they ran from it, and they lobbied against it, and then finally they said, we do have a problem. The Kimberley process is imperfect. The fact that Zimbabwean diamonds were not considered conflict diamonds is a huge gaping hole in that process. But it's a step in the right direction, and even if it's imperfect to start, at least we're making that effort.
Yeah, do something. Something is better than
something is usually better than nothing.
Usually. That's fair. So I want to change gears a little and go to you personally. You're a physician, an author, an assistant professor at the U of T, a mother, a board member, and the founder and executive director of World Child Canada. And you're also in the midst of setting up World Child US. When exactly do you sleep?
Between 3 and 5 in the morning. No, sleep is overrated, is it not?
No, it's not. It is a glorious part of life. You should try it more often.
No one is claiming I'm doing all of those things well, by the way. You know what? I mean, it's one of those things, and this is going to sound so trite, and I apologize in advance, but when you do what you love, there really is no distinction between your on time and your off time, right? So when I'm reading about foreign policy and global issues. When I'm sitting around the dinner table, we're discussing and debating these issues, and I have a limitless passion for the work that War Child does around the world, and so not championing that it feels like like I'm just being disconnected from myself in many ways. So it's about, for me, I'm not tired by what I do, I'm energized by it. I get more tired when I'm not doing it, when I feel that, I haven't done enough. And that's when I feel most frustrated.
It's like the ultimate substitute for coffee for you.
It is, yes. Well, or coffee it's just, I was going to say wine there, but but I still like my wine.
These aren't mutually exclusive.
That's right.
You can still have wine.
That's right. No, I'm lucky. I get to do what I'm passionate about, and we can't all say that in life.
That's fantastic. Do you guys have any questions in the audience? I want to be cognizant and not just hug the mic the whole time. Margot, just go up to the mic if you can. Vera.
You talked a little bit earlier about Canadians' perception as being peacekeepers, when the reality is that we are a big part and a growing part of the distribution of weapons. I'm curious if you've had a chance to sit down with our relatively new government, Prime Minister Trudeau or anybody in his circle, and what their view is on where we are today and trying to correct some of these issues that we might be contributing towards.
That's an excellent question, and I have had some of those conversations, and they are certainly ongoing. and I have testified at the Standing Committee on Foreign Affairs over the last couple of years on a few of these related issues. I think one of the most significant things, though, that Canada can do and should be doing is signing the Arms Trade Treaty. The Arms Trade Treaty was initially a Canadian-led effort to try to bring about international binding legislation concerning the sale, the manufacturing, the stockpiling, and the transfer of small and light weapons in the world. And about 2 years ago now, in fact, it finally passed to the United Nations, and more than 115 countries have signed on to it. Unfortunately, along with Russia and China, Canada has not yet signed the Arms Trade Treaty, and because we missed the first deadline, now we have to pass a whole series of pieces of legislation before we're even eligible to sign it. And there is, and I'm going to be very, very clear on this one point, there is no way that if we had signed the Arms Trade Treaty, we would have been able to approve that $15 billion arms deal to Saudi Arabia or to Thailand subsequently. So now, the current government has committed to signing the Arms Trade Treaty, but there has been no official deadline prescribed in relation to that. And because it is contingent upon these other pieces of legislation falling into place, I don't know how long that's going to take, or if it is even going to be during this particular parliamentary cycle. I hope that it is. It is absolutely the right thing to do. And as we talk about re-engaging with the world and revitalizing our multilateralist traditions as a country, we certainly need to understand that our absence from the Arms Trade Treaty and the reputation in many instances of our mining sector and some of the violations of human rights and labor violations in relation to that, that has really thrown some of our credibility into question. And so if we really want to get there, if we want to still be seen as that strong, vibrant, ethical force in the world, then we do have to get some of these other pieces in order. So hopefully they'll see that as one and the same.
We have a lot of good intentions as a nation. We need to start actually acting on them.
Yeah. We've made some strides, though. We have.
Margot, could you ask, just because there are people on VC,
And what was the reasoning for missing the first opportunity?
It was under the last government, the Harper government. So they did not sign the Arms Trade Treaty when they had that opportunity. And in fact, the domestic gun lobby in Canada did a pretty good job, even though it has nothing to do with domestic gun ownership. They did a pretty good job of making people feel that it was an effort. The NRA did the same in the United States, an effort to control domestic arms sales and use.
Thank you.
It's like anything else with the arms industry. There's a lot more propaganda and irrational thinking out there on this subject than there is fact and honest appraisal.
and you have a very small number of interests, both numerically and monetarily, who seem to hold the entire agenda hostage. In the U.S., the huge debate going on. I think they may actually still be debating in Congress. They had a filibuster all night. The majority of Americans support efforts like this. The majority of Canadians support efforts like this, but a tiny group of vested interests can block that legislation. How important do you think political activism is on the part of individuals, writing to our members of parliament, writing to our senators, writing to our congresspeople?
I think it's absolutely critical. Politicians are swayed by public opinion, and
strongly worded letters really do.
There isn't a politician out there that isn't concerned about re-election. So if you have enough people who are mounting an opposition to a particular policy, a particular point of view, politicians are going to listen to that. Part of the reason why the Arms Trade Treaty didn't get signed is that there simply wasn't enough public interest or concern or outcry that we hadn't signed it yet, and that's a great shame. And I think the same applies to the United States. When you have the majority of Americans who are at least committed to introducing certain aspects of gun control legislation around particularly semi-automatic weapons like the AR-15, people who are on terrorist watch lists, I mean, we're talking about people who have a very clear mental health history that would be deemed to be high risk. I mean, that is a public safety issue.
People on the terrorist no-fly list.
People on the terrorist no-fly list. I mean, that is a public safety issue, and they are right to be shaming and embarrassing those legislators who cannot get behind what the majority of Americans want.
Yeah, and even here in Canada, we had a member of parliament who was making the case that the AR-15 is a perfectly safe device when handled properly. So is heroin. So is plutonium. We don't let you have that either. And also made the case that it's a great deer hunting weapon. I've never seen anybody go hunting with an AR-15.
And that's a great point. And I would add to that too. People will often say, well, if people want to kill each other, they're going to find a way. And they will cite different wars around the world in which machetes were used and other things to slaughter hundreds of thousands of people. But the truth is that in almost every instance, it's having access to those small weapons that in fact also facilitated that particular slaughter, because usually it's people with arms that are able to then move the populations or control or prevent anybody who's trying to stop that from happening. So the two often go hand in hand.
And the case for making it easier isn't a good idea, right?
No.
Yeah, they might find a way, but there's not a lot of kids who get killed by stray strangling.
Well, that's right.
That's not a thing.
That's right. And you have a much better chance of being able to stop that person. The more automatic that weapon is, the more violent that weapon is, the greater the destruction.
Excellent. Any other audience questions or Dory questions, Vera?
So here at Google, we have employee resource groups, of which the largest is Women at Google. There's a pretty strong chapter in our office, led by Margot here, and Nancy, who's sitting right next to her. So the first time that I saw you speak was at the WXN Summit in November. You were the keynote at the awards gala that night. And we were all just in love with you after that. We thought you had a lot of great perspective on life in general. And what I loved about the way that you spoke was that it was not, I'm speaking to the girls. This is among us girls. You just had a great perspective in life in general. That being said, I think you had a lot to say about what it's like being in your role and going through your life being you, being a woman, and having some of the barriers that you did. So I'd love if you could kind of talk about that for this group.
Well, thank you. It's nice to see you again. Look, there's no question that being a woman and doing this kind of work comes with its own set of challenges. We're in environments around the world where there's a tremendous amount of sexual violence, a huge amount of harassment. I mean, I've personally experienced a great deal of that myself, and risk, and then trying to juggle everything. I never use the word balance. Balance for me is always such a cliche, because I, without exaggeration, wake up every day and deal with what's on fire. And if I can put out those fires, that is a banner day for me. So balance, I think, is something that is sort of a mythology. It's where you find balance where you find leprechauns and rainbow-colored unicorns.
Sounds like a fabulous place.
But so that it does come with certain risks, and for me, the only way that I've discovered to contend with that is just to stare them down, to get back up and to get back in there and to persevere, to defy. And I've been doing that in my entire life, and you get that from the time as a girl, from the time that you're this big, right? Girls can't play in the park, girls can't do this, girls can't do that. Well, girls can do those things, and girls are doing those things, and we're going to show you that we can do them better. And that's the message that I try to convey to young women all the time, which is to speak up, to speak out, to be undaunted, to don't seek permissions. In my opinion, permissions are only sought by those who lack imagination, and don't be afraid to screw up, and don't worry so much about whether people like you. I'm sure there's an entire fleet of people out there who can't stand me, and I know there is, because in fact I hear from them on Twitter quite often, especially some of those NRA folks. They love me, and I think that we don't hear enough really women's voices, and and we don't role model enough, and we don't mentor that enough, I think. And so for all of you here as women who are in the tech industry, I think it's really incumbent on you too to be out there and to be talking about your experiences and to be getting other young women involved and to be defying those stereotypes. Because when I first started in this work, there were hardly any women going in and out of war zones. There were hardly any, war was always seen as traditionally a male domain. And now I'm astonished every time I walk into the office, and we have so many more women in our office than we do men. They're definitely the visible minority in our office. And that's great. That is great, especially when you're talking about working with civilians in war zones. That usually the ones who are most impacted by war are civilians, primarily women and children. So having women on the front lines of those conversations, trying to do something about it, is critical to our success and to eventually eradicating the problem.
In your book, in the intro, you mention that you don't think that war is a part of the human condition and that there is hope. After reading it and listening to your TED Talk, I'm just struck by how complicated these issues are. What keeps you hopeful?
A couple of things, but I would say I don't fear that complexity. I think that part of it is there aren't always easy fixes and easy answers, and we mislead people when we pretend that that isn't true.
Despite what campaign promises
promises are out there, right? And I think that for all of us, as we move forward, it is important to be more sophisticated around what works and what doesn't work, and that it is complicated, and it's time for us to embrace that complexity. So that I would say sort of partly that. But for me, ultimately, what I find most hopeful is that we are every day at War Child in our office, we are surrounded by people who are a testament to what can be done with compassion and some ingenuity and concern and a sense of strong global citizenship. We hear from people who are in our programs where it really has changed their lives. We hear from staff who run those programs, who helped build those programs, just how important our work is to their community and how respected they feel and how engaged they feel. And that ours is a true partnership, that we're not coming in and telling them what to do, but we're asking them what they want to do. And that they feel valued in that process. And so whenever I find myself extremely frustrated, which is often, and it's never about the things that you would expect. I mean, we're dealing with security situations all the time, which are very frustrating, but it's often seeing a fantastic program like the one we have in Eastern Congo that survives on fumes because it's so hard to mobilize public interest for that war now that it's almost 20 years old, despite how devastating it has been. That's the stuff that keeps me up at night. But I get up and I push through that sense of cynicism and frustration because people depend on us. And it always has seemed very self-indulgent to me to say, oh, this work is exhausting and I don't want to do it anymore. I mean, we've got people around the world that get shot at on their way to work, whose children can't go more than 2 blocks because they'll be raped. In South Sudan, where all of our staff and program partners had to flee to the refugee camps. And within 2 days of them arriving at the refugee camps, they said, we're going to keep going. And we went, well, hang on a second. We're still trying to figure out where the stuff is. The whole office has been burned and torched and looted. They're like, no, we're here now. We're good to go. And that is extraordinary. And it's breathtaking when you experience it. And it makes me really hopeful. And that's why I get up every day.
That's fantastic. Vera, how are we doing for time? Okay, excellent. So in that case, I'm going to leave it on that. Everyone here, I encourage you to take Samantha's request seriously. We have a donation matching program at Google. You can set it up so that part of your every single paycheck goes to an organization like War Child to help in conflict zones that people may have forgotten about, that they're no longer in the headlines. Write those strongly worded letters to your members of parliament. Try to make that difference. And we have some books, I think, at the back. Damnation's fantastic read, and definitely check out the TED Talk as well on TED.com.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.